Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. On the surface, Kelvin and Ruth Parker appeared to be the perfect couple, admired by many, envied by some. Kelvin, a charismatic and ambitious entrepreneur, had built a reputation as a self-made millionaire. His company, Parker Enterprises, was a household name in the real estate industry, and he basked in the praise that came with it. Everywhere he went, people spoke of his success, calling him a visionary. What no one saw, however, was the woman who stood behind him, his wife, Ruth. She was the silent force that had helped shape his empire, yet Kelvin rarely acknowledged her contributions. From the beginning, Ruth had been deeply involved in his business affairs, handling finances, refining contracts, and even making critical decisions when Kelvin's impulsiveness threatened to derail their progress. But in public, Kelvin made it seem as though he alone had built everything. Ruth, ever the patient and strategic thinker, never argued. She let him take the spotlight, knowing that her true power lay in what she had built behind the scenes. Their marriage had not always been this way. When they first met, Kelvin was struggling to establish himself, a man with big dreams but little financial means. Ruth, fresh out of business school, had been drawn to his ambition and confidence. She believed in him, supporting him both emotionally and financially, helping him secure investors when no one else would. It was Ruth who had encouraged him to take calculated risks, to structure his business properly, and to avoid reckless investments. As Parker Enterprises grew, so did Kelvin's ego. Over time, his appreciation for Ruth's support diminished, replaced by an arrogance that made him believe he was invincible. He began speaking about the company as though it was his sole achievement, disregarding the fact that Ruth had played an instrumental role in its success. He stopped listening to her advice, dismissing her insights as unnecessary. When she tried to warn him about risky deals or remind him of financial obligations, he would wave her off, telling her to focus on being a wife while he handled the real work. As the years passed, Ruth watched the man she once loved transform into a version of himself she barely recognized. The warm, passionate Kelvin she had fallen for had become a self-absorbed businessman obsessed with his own image. He cared more about board meetings, media appearances, and extravagant displays of wealth than he did about their marriage. Ruth, who had always been understanding, began to feel like a mere shadow in his life, present but invisible. He no longer sought her opinion, no longer spent quality time with her, and when he was home, his attention was always elsewhere. But she remained patient, hoping that at some point Kelvin would realize how far he had drifted and come back to her. Yet the distance between them only widened. She started hearing whispers, rumors of Kelvin's affairs, late nights with a younger woman, unexplained business trips. At first she ignored them, refusing to believe that the man she had built a life with would betray her. But deep down, a gnawing sense of doubt had already taken root. One evening, as Ruth sat alone in their grand yet eerily silent mansion, she realized the painful truth. Kelvin no longer saw her as his partner. She was simply a fixture in his life, someone to keep up appearances but nothing more. It was in that moment that she made a decision. She would no longer sit in the background, waiting for him to realize her worth. What Kelvin had forgotten was that while he had been busy showing off his so-called success, she had been working quietly in the background, securing her position, and soon he would realize just how much he had underestimated her. Ruth had always trusted Kelvin, or at least she had convinced herself that she should. They had built a life together, endured struggles, and celebrated successes. Yet, something in the air had changed. At first, it was subtle, missed dinners, cancelled plans, phone calls taken in hushed tones. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that work was simply demanding, that Kelvin had new business deals to focus on. But soon the changes became undeniable. He started dressing differently, more effort in his appearance, a sudden interest in cologne he had never used before. His phone, once left carelessly around the house, was now always in his pocket or face down on the table. Late nights at the office turned into entire weekends away. Excuses became repetitive, lacking the conviction they once carried. The distance between them was no longer just emotional, it was physical. The warmth that had once existed in their marriage had been replaced by cold, scripted conversations and fleeting eye contact. Ruth, sharp and observant as always, decided to take note of every inconsistency. She knew that confronting Kelvin outright would be useless. He would dismiss her concerns, call her paranoid, and flip the blame on her. So she waited, carefully observing, collecting details. One evening, she checked their shared credit card statements and noticed unusual transactions: jewelry from high-end stores, expensive restaurant bills, hotel bookings in the city. She had never received any of these gifts. Her heart clenched as realization settled in. It wasn't just business keeping Kelvin away. He had another woman, but still she did not react. She refused to be the emotional, scorned wife who lashed out without proof. If Kelvin had indeed betrayed her, she needed to know the full extent of it. She needed evidence, and most importantly, she needed a plan. Because when the moment came, she would not be the one caught off guard. A few weeks later, Ruth's suspicions were confirmed in the cruelest way. She had hired a private investigator, a decision that had not been easy but necessary. The photographs were damning: Kelvin with a younger woman, Vanessa at intimate dinners, their hands intertwined as they laughed. Hotel entrances, secret getaways, images that left no room for doubt. Ruth felt a strange sense of calm as she flipped through the photos. There was no shock, no overwhelming sadness, only clarity. The man she had loved and sacrificed for had been lying to her for months, possibly years. But the most painful part wasn't the infidelity itself. It was the sheer arrogance with which he carried it out. He had paraded Vanessa around as if Ruth did not exist, taking her to the same places they once frequented, spending the same money that Ruth had helped him build. He had done all of this without the slightest fear of consequences, fully believing that Ruth would simply accept it and fade into the background. That was his greatest mistake. From that moment, Ruth knew she had to play her role carefully. She couldn't allow Kelvin to suspect that she was aware of his betrayal. If he believed she was still in the dark, he would continue making mistakes, mistakes she could use to her advantage. So she continued as if nothing had changed. She kissed him goodbye when he left for work, smiled politely at social events, played the perfect, unsuspecting wife. But beneath the surface, she was preparing for war. She began reviewing the legal documents of Parker Enterprises, double-checking the shares and ownership agreements she had quietly secured over the years. She met with her financial advisors, ensuring that every asset in her name was protected. Slowly, methodically, she was setting the stage. Because when Kelvin finally decided to discard her, thinking she was powerless, she would be ready. Kelvin was no longer careful. Now that he had convinced himself that Ruth was oblivious to his affairs, he paraded Vanessa like a trophy. It started with discreet meetings in hidden restaurants, but soon he stopped hiding. He took her to the most exclusive events, introducing her to influential businessmen as if she were his wife. Ruth, watching from the shadows, remained composed. Every gala, every business function where Kelvin arrived with Vanessa on his arm only solidified what Ruth already knew. He was a man who believed in his own invincibility. He had convinced himself that she was weak, that she would never dare to challenge him. Vanessa, young and ambitious, fed his ego, laughing at his jokes, clinging to his arm as though she had already replaced Ruth. The whispers followed Ruth wherever she went, sympathetic glances from women who pitied her, condescending smirks from those who saw her as a fool. But she did not react. Instead, she absorbed humiliation, storing it away like fuel for the fire that was soon to burn everything Kelvin held dear. The night of the annual Parker Enterprises charity gala was when things took an unforgivable turn. Ruth had debated whether she should even attend, but she knew it was necessary. She arrived dressed in an elegant black gown, her demeanor composed and graceful as always. She made polite conversation, acknowledging the greetings of familiar faces. Then, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. Kelvin walked in hand with Vanessa. The room fell into stunned silence, followed by hushed whispers. He had finally crossed the last line, openly disrespecting her in front of their business associates, friends, and the media. Vanessa, glowing with victory, clung to his arm as if to stake her claim. Kelvin smirked, as if daring Ruth to make a scene. But instead of reacting with rage or hurt, Ruth merely smiled and lifted her champagne glass in their direction. She did not flinch, did not break down, she simply watched. And in that moment, Kelvin made his final mistake. He believed her silence was surrender. As the night went on, Ruth noticed how Vanessa moved through the crowd, introducing herself as though she were already Kelvin's wife. She listened as people whispered about how Ruth had been so naive, how she had let her husband slip away. But what they didn't know was that Ruth was neither naive nor weak, she was patient. And patience in war was the most valuable weapon. At the height of the night, when the charity auction was in full swing, Kelvin took to the stage to make an announcement. He cleared his throat, his arrogance dripping from every word. He thanked everyone for attending, praised the company's success, and then, in a move that shocked even those who had anticipated his audacity, he introduced Vanessa as his partner. The insult was clear. He had not just betrayed Ruth, he had erased her in front of everyone. The crowd gasped, some exchanging awkward glances, others relishing the drama. Ruth, however, remained unmoved. She simply took a sip of her wine and nodded. That night, as Ruth left the event, she felt no sadness, only resolve. Kelvin had given her everything she needed. His arrogance, his public display of betrayal, his underestimation of her intelligence, these would all be the tools of his downfall. The world had seen her as the humiliated wife, the woman who had lost everything to a younger mistress. What they didn't know was that the true battle had yet to begin, and when it did, there would be no mercy. Kelvin barely waited before making his next move. Emboldened by his public display at the gala, he no longer saw the need for pretense. He had Vanessa where he wanted her, and in his mind, Ruth was nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared out of the way. He came home late that night, reeking of expensive cologne that wasn't his usual brand, his tie undone and his expression smug. Ruth had been expecting him. She sat in the dimly lit living room, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. He barely acknowledged her before dropping onto the couch with an exaggerated sigh. Then, with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he had already won, he spoke. "Ruth, I think it's time we ended this. I want a divorce." His voice was devoid of hesitation, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than the end of their marriage. He leaned back, watching for her reaction, expecting anger, tears, or perhaps desperate pleading. Instead, Ruth tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. For the first time, Kelvin hesitated. Ruth's lack of reaction unsettled him. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, imagined how she would break down, beg him to reconsider, or at the very least lash out in fury. But none of that happened. She merely sat there, her eyes calm and calculating. "A divorce," she repeated, her voice soft, almost amused. Kelvin shifted uncomfortably, irritation creeping into his tone. "Yes, a divorce. Let's not drag this out, Ruth. I'll make sure you're taken care of." He spoke as though he were offering charity, as though she were some dependent who needed his generosity. That was when Ruth finally let out a small laugh, not one of amusement, but of disbelief. "Taken care of?" she echoed, shaking her head. "Kelvin, do you even hear yourself?" She stood up then, smoothing out the fabric of her dress. "Fine, let's settle this in court." Her words were simple, devoid of emotion, but they sent a chill down Kelvin's spine. He had expected her to crumble. Instead, she was making this far too easy. The days that followed were filled with legal proceedings, but Kelvin hardly paid attention. He believed he had already won. He strutted through meetings with his lawyers, barely listening to their advice. To him, this was a mere formality, a step toward his new life with Vanessa. He had already made plans, arranging for the luxurious penthouse they would move into, the vacations they would take. The only thing left was to finalize the divorce and watch Ruth fade into obscurity. He didn't even bother to check the details of their financial agreements. After all, Parker Enterprises was his. Ruth had never been involved beyond being his supportive wife. He had ensured long ago that everything was under his name, or so he thought. So when Ruth's legal team requested a formal court hearing, he smirked, viewing it as unnecessary dramatics. "She wants to put on a show," he scoffed to Vanessa, who giggled and kissed his cheek. Let her. It won't change a thing. His confidence was unshaken, his arrogance blinding him to the storm that was about to come. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Kelvin walked in with the air of a man who had already secured his victory. Dressed in an expensive suit, he smirked at Ruth, who sat across from him, her demeanor poised but unreadable. The judge began proceedings, and as Kelvin's lawyer presented his case, he sat back barely listening. But then, something shifted. Ruth's lawyer stood up, holding a thick folder of documents. Your Honor, before proceeding with the division of assets, we would like to present irrefutable proof that my client, Ruth Parker, is the majority shareholder of Parker Enterprises, owning 60% of the company. The words landed like a thunderclap. Kelvin sat up straight, his smirk fading. He blinked, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. What? He muttered under his breath. His lawyer turned to him, visibly unsettled. Ruth, sitting across the courtroom, finally met Kelvin's eyes, and for the first time since this all began, she smiled. Kelvin felt the world tilt as the weight of the words settled in his chest. Ruth Parker owns 60% of Parker Enterprises. The courtroom was silent, but in his mind there was chaos. His lawyer, visibly rattled, fumbled through his documents, looking for something, anything that would disprove the claim. But there was nothing. Kelvin's smirk was gone, his usual arrogance stripped away. His hands clenched into fists as he turned to Ruth, who sat with the same composed expression she had worn throughout this entire ordeal. But now he understood. She had never been naive. She had never been weak. She had played him from the very beginning, silently preparing for this moment while he had paraded around with his mistress, believing he was untouchable. How? The question burned in his mind, but the answer was already clear. Ruth had been handling his finances for years, managing the company's structure while he basked in the spotlight. And at some point, without him even noticing, she had secured the majority of the company right under his nose. The judge allowed Ruth's lawyer to present the evidence, official documents proving the share distribution, the board's confirmation, and the financial records that traced back years. Kelvin's heart pounded as he scanned the files. His name was there, of course, but next to Ruth's, his 40% ownership suddenly looked insignificant. His lawyer, now pale, tried to argue, stumbling over legal jargon, but the truth was undeniable. Kelvin had been a fool, and now everyone knew it. He could hear whispers behind him, business associates, reporters, former allies murmuring in disbelief. The great Kelvin Parker, the man who claimed to have built an empire, had just discovered that he had never truly owned it. Panic set in. This wasn't just about Ruth walking away with a settlement. This was a complete power shift. She owned the company. She controlled everything. And worse, she had kept it hidden until now, waiting for him to make the fatal mistake of underestimating her. Vanessa, sitting in the audience, shifted uncomfortably. Kelvin could feel her eyes on him, could sense the shift in her demeanor. The confident, seductive woman who had once clung to him so desperately now sat rigid, her expression unreadable. He knew what she was thinking. What happens now? If Ruth controlled the company, what did that mean for him? Vanessa had never been in this for love. She had been in it for power, for status. And in a matter of minutes, Kelvin had gone from the king of his empire to a man who had just lost everything. His mind raced, searching for a way out. He had to stop this. He had to regain control. Maybe he could settle. Maybe Ruth would take the money and leave. But one look at her told him otherwise. This wasn't about money. This was about power. She wasn't just leaving. She was taking everything. And there was nothing he could do about it. As the judge finalized the ruling, Kelvin barely heard the words. His mind was clouded, his breathing shallow. The gavel hit the wood, sealing his fate. Ruth stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and for the first time she spoke directly to him. You should have listened to me, Kelvin. Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words crushed him. She turned, walking out of the courtroom with the quiet dignity of a woman who had just dismantled a kingdom with nothing but patience and intelligence. Kelvin, still seated, felt frozen. The cameras flashed, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. He wanted to move, to say something, to fix what had just happened, but was too late. He had played his game and he had lost. And Ruth. She had just won the battle he never even knew she was fighting. Kelvin sat in his car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The weight of the courtroom's revelation still sat heavy on his chest. Ruth owned Parker Enterprises. The words replayed in his mind over and over like a cruel joke he couldn't escape. His entire identity, his success, his empire, his reputation had been built on belief that he was in control. But today that illusion shattered. The media had already spun the narrative. Business mogul loses his own company to estranged wife in divorce battle. He could already imagine the headlines mocking him, the whispers at business meetings, the knowing smirks from those who had envied him for years. He had walked into that courtroom believing he would leave victorious, expecting to be the one to dictate the terms. Instead, Ruth had stripped him of everything, his pride, his power, his legacy, without ever raising her voice. She had played the long game, and he had been too arrogant to see it. Inside his mind, everything was chaos. How had she done it? How had she managed to take control of his company without him noticing? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. He had never been paying attention. He had spent years treating Ruth as an accessory, someone to stand beside him, not someone who could outmaneuver him. He had ignored the paperwork she handled, the contracts she reviewed, the board meetings she sat in. He had been too busy feeding his own ego to notice that the woman he had dismissed had securing her own power right under his nose. And now she had all the leverage. His phone vibrated in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. It was Vanessa. He hesitated before answering, already sensing the shift in her tone. "Kelvin, what's going on? Are these reports true?" Her voice lacked the warmth it once had. He gritted his teeth, irritation flaring inside him. He had spent months building a future with her, promising her the world. But now? Now he was nothing. He took a deep breath, trying to salvage what little control he had left. "Vanessa, don't listen to the media. This is just a setback." "A setback?" she interrupted, her voice sharper now. "Kelvin, the company is in Ruth's hands. Your assets are frozen until the division is finalized. Do you even have a plan?" The words stung not just because she was right, but because he could already hear it in her tone, doubt. The same woman who had clung to him at every event, who had whispered promises of a future together, now sounded hesitant. Ruth had not only destroyed his career, but she had also planted the first seed of Vanessa's doubt. Kelvin clenched his jaw. He couldn't lose Vanessa too, not now. He needed someone on his side. "I'll fix this," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Just trust me." There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "Call me when you actually have something to fix." And then, just like that, she hung up. Kelvin slammed his fist against the dashboard, rage bubbling inside him. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. He had built Parker Enterprises from nothing, and there was no way he was going to sit back and let Ruth take it from him. She may have outmaneuvered him this time, but he wasn't done. He would fight back. He would find a way to reclaim what was his. But as he stared at the glowing city skyline, a bitter thought crept into his mind. Was there even anything left to reclaim? Kelvin barely slept in the days following the court ruling. Every moment was spent scrambling for solutions, making desperate phone calls to board members, trying to find a way to claw back some form of control. But the more he fought, the more he realized how tightly Ruth had secured her position. The board was not on his side. Investors were hesitant to engage with him after the public embarrassment. Clients who once admired him were now shifting their attention to Ruth. He had underestimated her for years, dismissing her as just his wife. But now the world saw what he had failed to recognize. Ruth was the true power behind Parker Enterprises. And the final blow came on a Monday morning when a press release from the company made its rounds in the media. The words hit him harder than any courtroom ruling. Parker Enterprises is proud to announce Ruth Parker as the new CEO. Her vision and leadership have been instrumental in the company's growth, and we look forward to the future under her guidance. Kelvin stared at the statement on his phone screen, his grip tightening as he read the words over and over. It was official. She had taken his company. not just as a legal owner, but as its face, its leader, its future. He turned on the TV, flipping through business channels, and there she was, Ruth, sitting across from an interviewer, her expression poised and confident. Ruth, how does it feel to be stepping into the role of CEO? The journalist asked. Ruth smiled, a calm but authoritative presence. It's a natural progression. I've been deeply involved in Parker Enterprises since its inception. While my role was less visible, I've always been committed to its success. Now I'm simply taking a more active leadership position. She made it sound so effortless, as if this had always been the plan, as if Kelvin had simply been keeping the seat warm for her. The interviewer leaned forward. Some reports suggest that your ex-husband, was unaware of the extent of your ownership. Any comment? Ruth's smile didn't falter. I believe it's important for all business owners to understand the details of their company structures. Overlooking fine print can be costly. Kelvin's blood boiled. She was humiliating him in front of the entire world. He grabbed the remote and flung it across the room, watching as it shattered against the wall. His mind raced. He had to do something, had to stop this before it was too late. But wasn't it already too late? The board had made its choice. The company belonged to Ruth now. She had taken everything, his reputation, his power, and now his influence. His phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from one of his former board members. Kelvin, we need to talk. The shareholders have concerns about your future with the company. It might be best if you step away completely. His breath caught in his throat. Step away. They were pushing him out completely. Not only had Ruth taken over, but now they were making it clear that he was no longer wanted. Kelvin gritted his teeth, his nails digging into his palms. No, he wouldn't go down like this. He wouldn't let Ruth erase him, wouldn't let her rewrite history as if he had never been the force behind Parker Enterprises. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much. He wouldn't be discarded like yesterday's news. He would fight. He didn't know how yet, but he would. Because if there was one thing Kelvin Parker refused to be, it was forgotten. Kelvin sat alone in his penthouse, the dim city lights flickering through the massive windows. The once luxurious space felt cold, empty, just like his life now. The empire he had flaunted, the power he had wielded, the respect he had commanded, all of it was gone. His phone had stopped ringing with business deals, and the board members who used to shower him with admiration now avoided his calls. The final humiliation had come that morning when his last remaining allies at Parker Enterprises officially requested that he sell his remaining 40% of shares and remove himself from any involvement in the company. It's best for the brand, they had said. Kelvin knew what that meant. Ruth didn't just want control, she wanted him erased. She wanted his name scrubbed from the company's history, as if he had never even existed. The realization sent a fresh wave of rage through him. How had it come to this? How had he let her do this to him? Desperation clawed at him. He needed to act fast. He couldn't just sit back and watch as Ruth reshaped his company, his legacy without him. He had spent days trying to negotiate, attempting to regain some control, but every door had slammed shut in his face. Investors no longer wanted to associate with him. Business partners who once praised him had turned to Ruth instead, seeing her as the true mastermind behind Parker Enterprises. Even his personal accounts had taken a hit. Ruth's legal team had been ruthless in the divorce settlement, ensuring that most of the liquid assets he once had were either frozen or legally bound to her. And then there was Vanessa, his greatest mistake. At first she had been patient, waiting for him to rebuild, to find a way back to power. But as the weeks dragged on and his situation worsened, her patience had run out. She had left 2 nights ago. No explanation, no fight, just an empty closet and a message on his phone. I can't do this, Kelvin. You're not the man I thought you were. He had stared at the screen for hours reading and rereading those words. Not the man she thought he was. What did she expect? Did she really believe he would just bounce back overnight? But deep down he knew the truth. Vanessa had never loved him. She had loved his power, his wealth, his status. And the moment all of that was gone, so was she. Now he was alone, truly alone. The friends he had once bragged to had disappeared. The employees who used to hang on to his every word now answered to Ruth. and the woman he had thrown everything away for had abandoned him the second he became useless. He had nothing. For the first time in his life, Kelvin Parker understood what it meant to be powerless. Completely, utterly powerless. He had mocked Ruth, believing she would be nothing without him. But the truth was brutal. He was nothing without her. She had been the backbone of his empire, the strategist behind his success, and the moment she took that power back, he had crumbled. He stared at the empty whiskey glass in his hand, his thoughts spiraling. How had he let this happen? He had thought he was untouchable, invincible. But Ruth had shown him just how wrong he was. And now, as he sat in the silence of his downfall, he realized something terrifying. There was no coming back from this. Ruth stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, overlooking the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the towering buildings, a sight she had admired many times before. But tonight it felt different. This was hers now. The office, the company, the power that had once belonged to Kelvin, all of it was in her hands. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of strategic moves, restructuring and reclaiming the vision she had once quietly nurtured in the shadows. But now she no longer had to stand in the background. She was in control. Her fingers traced the edge of her desk, a custom-made mahogany masterpiece Kelvin had once sat behind, believing himself to be untouchable. Now he was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a man who had let arrogance blind him to the strength of the woman beside him. Her phone buzzed with another notification, an email from the board of directors, fully endorsing her latest expansion strategy. She smiled. It hadn't been easy to earn their complete trust, but after seeing the way she handled the takeover, they had no doubts about her leadership. She was no longer just Kelvin Parker's wife. She was Ruth Parker, CEO of Parker Enterprises, and every decision she made now was for her own legacy, not his. She thought back to the night of the charity gala, to the whispers and pitying looks from the women in their social circle. They had believed she was a fool, a woman who had let her husband slip away. If only they had known. Ruth had played the long game, and now she had everything. And Kelvin, he had been left with nothing. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant stepped in, a bright smile on her face. "Miss Parker, your car is ready. The board dinner starts in an hour." Ruth nodded, grabbing her coat. As she walked through the sleek modern halls of Parker Enterprises, employees greeted her with newfound respect. Some had been skeptical at first, unsure if she could fill Kelvin's shoes, but those doubts had quickly faded. She wasn't just filling his shoes, she was surpassing him. Unlike Kelvin, she didn't run the company with ego. She listened, she strategized, and most importantly, she valued the people who made the company successful. Under her leadership, Parker Enterprises was already seeing growth in areas Kelvin had neglected. She had made difficult decisions, cutting ties with investors who had once been loyal to her ex-husband, securing deals that Kelvin had dismissed as too risky. Every move was calculated, every step purposeful. She wasn't just winning, she was thriving. And the best part, she had done it all on her own terms. As she stepped into the black luxury sedan waiting outside, she took one last glance at the towering Parker Enterprises building. She had spent years being overlooked, underestimated, cast aside by the very man who had once sworn to love her. But she had risen from the ashes of their broken marriage, not as a victim, but as a woman who had taken back her power. The past was behind her now. Kelvin was behind her. She had built something greater than revenge. She had built a future. And as the city lights flickered around her, Ruth Parker smiled. This was just the beginning. Kelvin sat in a rundown bar, his fingers wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey. The stale scent of cheap alcohol and regret clung to him like a second skin. The man who once commanded boardrooms, who had walked into events with his head high and his name respected, was now nothing more than a shadow of himself. The past few months had been brutal. Every attempt to reclaim his footing had failed. He had been blacklisted from the industry, abandoned by his allies, and left with nothing but his own arrogance to blame. Parker Enterprises, the company he had once considered his, was thriving under Ruth's leadership. Every article, every news segment praised her vision, her strategies, her success. His name was never even mentioned anymore. He had become irrelevant, and as he sat there drowning in his failures, he realized the bitter truth. Ruth hadn't just beaten him, she had erased him. He had tried to fight back. He had begged, negotiated, even attempted to buy his way back into the company, but Ruth had been one step ahead of him at every turn. She had ensured that the board never entertained his pleas, that his name never resurfaced in business discussions. And when he had reached out to her directly, desperate for a conversation, she had sent a single message through her lawyer. Kelvin, I hope you've learned the cost of underestimating the wrong woman. There is nothing left for you here. Move on. The words had burned more than any courtroom ruling, more than Vanessa's betrayal, more than losing his fortune. She had made it clear he was finished, no second chances. No redemption arc, just complete and utter irrelevance. The same man who had once believed Ruth was nothing without him was now the one being forgotten. Ruth, on the other hand, had flourished. The world no longer saw her as Kelvin Parker's ex-wife. She was Ruth Parker, the powerhouse CEO, the woman who had turned Parker Enterprises into an empire. Interviews, magazine covers, keynote speeches. She had taken everything he had once claimed as his own and made it greater. And she had done it without him. The whispers in their old social circles had changed too. Did you hear what happened to Kelvin Parker? He's completely washed up. I heard he tried to start a new business, but no one would fund him. He had become a cautionary tale, a man who lost everything because of his own arrogance. Ruth had built something that even his worst attempts to sabotage couldn't destroy. And that was the ultimate victory. As Kelvin took the last sip of his drink, he finally understood. He had lost, and there was no coming back. There was no last-minute redemption, no dramatic comeback story. Ruth had won completely and irrevocably. She had taken what was rightfully hers, and she had done it with patience, intelligence, and ruthless precision. And now, as he sat alone, forgotten and irrelevant, he realized that this was the ending he had written for himself. Ruth hadn't destroyed him. He had done that all on his own. And as the bartender took away his empty glass, Kelvin Parker finally accepted the one truth he had fought so hard to deny. He had been replaced, and the world had already moved on without him. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.